All right, guys, welcome to another TLDR. In this one, we're going to be doing modern JavaScript. We're going to be covering the features of ES6, ES7, and ES8, all the important ones, the ones that matter, the ones that you might actually use in the workplace, in an actual project. I am your host for this evening, as I will be for every TLDR, Dylan Israel. C stands for Christopher, short for Christ, also coding God. That's it. That's a joke. Some people don't like that joke. That's okay. Let's move on. So, what will we cover, right? We said some topics, but what specifically are we going to be covering? Let's make sure it's worth your time, right? There's a ton of tutorials out there, and we want to make sure that you're learning everything that you can. So in this video, we're going to be covering constant let and block scope, template literals, destructuring objects, destructuring arrays. We're going to be talking about object literals, the for of loop, the spread operator, the rest operator, arrow functions, default params, export and import, trailing commas, includes, async and await, sets, classes, and then we're going to be also talking about pad start, pad end, the exponential operator, object.values, object.entries. We're going to be talking about maps, object.getOwnProperty descriptor, and descriptors, and that's it. So we're going to be covering quite a bit. What is that, about 3, 6, 8, about 23 points. These are things that I find myself using on a regular basis in the workplace, as well as ones that I think are fun and exciting. And so that's what we're going to be covering, so that you can make sure to write JavaScript in today's standards, right? A lot of us learn a language, and we sometimes don't know what are things we should use, what are things we shouldn't use, and everything in here is the latest and the greatest, and so it should get you up and running. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. You're the type that likes to learn. That's why you're watching this video. And so if you're trying to learn, might I recommend our boys over at devmountain.com, Dev Mountain Coding Bootcamp. They got courses to learn you real well on iOS development, Salesforce development, software Q&A, user experience design, and of course, full stack web development. I've seen their campuses. They're beautiful, and they free house. So let's start by talking a little bit about constant let, because I think it's probably the most important thing of the addition. So constant let are new variable types, and moving forward you should pretty much deprecate using var and replace it with let or const. But to understand why these were created, specifically let, you have to understand what how variable hoisting works in JavaScript. So you'll see here we have this if statement with this var, and we can set it to a value. We'll just set it to hello world. We're not going to be using that value, but in our console log here, when we target example, it may surprise you that we actually get undefined instead of if this didn't exist, example is not defined, or get an error. This is because in the actual JavaScript, what's happening here is the variable var is being hoisted. So var example is actually being defined to here, and then if in our false statement, we are getting, example is equal to hello world. So that's variable hoisting. And part of the issue with this is it does some wonky stuff that you may not expect. And we've been given stricter modes of control when it comes to constant let. And they do what is, so variable hoisting is function scoped, and constant let are doing what is called block scope, which means essentially in this block of code, meaning within these brackets, this is where this variable exists. So now if we change this var to a let, you'll see example is not defined, and it gives us much more control, and it makes a lot more sense, right? If example is supposed to only exist between here, it doesn't make a lot of sense to be having a logic outside of our scope. So that's the block scope aspect of constant let and why it exists. One thing to keep in mind is that you use let when you are going to be reassigning values. So in our example, if we wanted to have let's go ahead and delete this stuff. If we wanted to reset any value here, say let, time equal today, and then we could say time is equal to tomorrow, we're going to assign different values with let. But const is kind of short for constant, and const example is going to be equal to 5, and so we can't actually take example and set it equal to 6, even though it's the same data type. It's not how const works. Basically any primitive numbers, primitive types being strings, booleans, and numbers. Const, you cannot reset the value. However, when you're working with arrays, like so, you get a little bit more flexibility where now you can actually add to the array, and so you can modify the array like so. That's fine, and you can see here that we're going to log it out. So we can modify the array, and same with objects, but we couldn't actually go and say, hey, I want to set this equal to an empty object, or I want to set this equal to a boolean. That doesn't work when it goes with const. And the same again is true for objects. So if we had an object here, we can go ahead and set example.name equal to Dylan, and that would work as well. So that's constant let and block scope as well. So template literals are a great addition to JavaScript. So say in the past we wanted to concatenate a string like so. You might have something that looks very similar to this. We have a variable first name, variable last name. We say, hi, my name is Dylan, put a space, Israel, put a space, put a period. It's very sort of jumbled. It's kind of gross in that sense, and it's not as clean as it should be. So template literals gives us the ability to use backticks in our strings here as well. So what we can do is we can clean up a lot of this logic here, and we can just use this $, curly brace, and we can put first name and then put a space, and then we can put last name, and what we get is a much more readable string. However, that's not it. We can also, we won't be able to see it in the console log here, but say we had multiple lines like so, and we wanted this to be on different lines. When it actually renders in the DOM, we would have a multi-line string, and we don't have to put those BR tags in or anything like we would normally. And so we get the ability to create multi-line strings as well as to dynamically inject our variables to have a very clean string that's easily readable and just better visually, I think, and easier to read. It's cleaner code, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So template literals is probably one of my favorite additions since ES6. Destructuring objects is another great addition to JavaScript. So let's take a look at our example here. We have personal information. This should probably be a const, just in general. Yeah. So we have personal information, first name, middle name, last name, and this is a pretty long name. All we want to do is maybe create a reference to it that's a little bit easier, and so we can do that by going and using these when dealing with objects. Have these two curly braces, and we can say, look, for first name, middle name, and last name, set it equal to personal information, and this will give us an opportunity to then get these values easier, and we don't have to do all the values, but we are destructuring the object so that we can, okay, well, we're referencing this object for these values, and we can also go ahead and assign aliases here. Oops, excuse me. So you'll see I'll put a :fn, and you'll see now that I can reference fn that way, and we can assign these values, and we could do this for any of the values, and again, we don't have to do all of them, but this is the destructuring objects, and there's destructuring arrays, which we'll talk about next. Alright, so destructuring arrays is very similar to destructuring objects. So we still have personal information, except it is an array now instead of an object, and we're just storing the string values in there. But let's say we wanted to create a reference to that. We could. The main difference here is that we can name these whatever we want, but they do go in order of index value. So you'll see here fname would be first name, that's index 0 essentially, and we would set this equal, and notice how we have the parentheses or the brackets because we are dealing with an array, and this will just be equal to the personal information, and now we would have access to the first name, and then we would separate it by commas and say middle name if we wanted to anyhow. But that's destructuring objects at the end of the day. And again, just one more time, it goes in order of operation, so 0, index, and 1. All right, so let's talk a little bit about object literals, another great addition to ECMAScript, and one of my more, and somewhat related to the previous destructuring for how you might use this. So here we have 4 variables. We have my first name, my middle name, my last name, and then we have a shameless plug for the Bro Do You Even Code shirt, phone case, mug, and more. Link in the description below. So what is an object literal? Essentially, let's say we're creating a new object here, and we'll just call this a example object. And we wanted to assign some values. And in our case, we could have, you know, a first name, which would be first, a last name or middle, which would be middle. And so we're assigning our values here, and then a last, which is last, and then shameless plug, which would be assigned to shameless plug. So, and then everything would print out just fine, right? We get our values, so on and so forth. Now, this looks like duplicate code really at the end of the day, and that's really what object literals allows us to get rid of, is it says, hey, I'm going to assume that if we don't have this assignment here, that this is the key and where the value is named the same appropriately, and we can eliminate these values. And so object literals gives us the ability to eliminate code, unnecessary code, and does the assignment when the name and when the key and the value are named the same thing for the variables. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the for of loop, which has been introduced. Say we want to iterate over an iterable. And I say iterable because we can use this for anything that can be iterated over. It's not just arrays. So we have our string here for first of Dylan, and then we have the various coding statuses as you progress through your software career, which is Yamcha, intern, developer, and then coding god, the 4 main ones. So the for of loop gives us the ability to iterate through all the elements in the iterable. So let's define it. So first thing we're going to define is a reference to the element. So we'll go through coding status. So we'll say let status of our iterable, which is in our case is coding statuses, and then we're just going to console.log that status. And you'll see we get our values and we do whatever we want with that. Now we can do the same for a string, right? Because a string is an iterable. So we'll say let char of first. And then you'll see here that we can then target and do whatever we want with this iterable. So if we're going to console.log the value of first, you'll see that, excuse me, of char, because first is the iterable, we'll get D, then Y, then L, then A, then N. So that's the for of loop. The spread operator is a great addition to JavaScript and allows us to unwrap our array values. So let's take our example here, our array where we have 3 of the prominent excuses I get from people who are trying to learn to code. It's too late to learn to code. No one wants to hire a junior developer, and then just the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. AI is going to take all the jobs. So let's say we had this other variable here. We'll call it hater2 excuses. And in here we have an array, and we want to not only have our own values, right, our own default values, and we'll put something like, you know, WordPress is taking all the jobs, period, and complaining. But we also want to add all the values from hater1 excuses, and we can use that with these 3 dots. This is the spread operator. What you'll see is when we console.log out hater2 excuses, it's going to actually concatenate all of that together, and it's going to unwrap the values in one array here to go ahead and unload them into another array. And that's really what the spread operator does, is it takes the values, it unloads them from the array and adds them to wherever you need them to be at, but just unwraps it at the end of the day. The spread operator can be used with more than just arrays. You can also use it with objects as well. So you'll see here we have refactored our hater1 excuses to now have a key of excuse standard, excuse typical, and excuse insane. And in our hater2 excuses, we have an object. Now, if we wanted to unwrap the key value pairs in our object, we would do the same thing with the spread operator on hater1 one excuses, and then you'll see it will be added there as well. So let's take this excuse insane, because one of the things that I do typically in my classes where I have default values but I'm assigning them through the constructor is I will assign we'll do fear, uncertainty, and doubt here, and it will override the value of our excuse insane, although we're not going to see it here because there's so much going on. So let's go ahead and comment these lines out real quick, and then you'll see it's going to get overwritten. So this is one way that you can handle default parameters as well as you unwrap these. And then say, for instance, excuse insane never existed, we'd have our default value. So if you are unwrapping these and the keys match, whichever one goes last is going to be the winner. So keep that in mind as you're using the spread operator with objects. So the rest operator is a great addition to JavaScript as well. Sometimes we don't know how many parameters are going to be passed in. So let's take a look at our function here, add, which is going to take in a certain amount of parameters. We don't know. It could be 1, and if we console.log out add, great. It's going to print out whatever numbers is. Let's go and put in 2 in here. So it prints out 2. But what if we had 3? Now nothing's printing out because this function doesn't exist. However, it does exist. It just doesn't know what to do with that 3 because there's no additional parameter here. And in the past, we'd have to do something like this where we could get the arguments object of a function, and essentially you would see it's an object that has the 0 spot, which would be 2, and then the 1 spot, which would be 3, and we would then have to turn that into an array, and you go from there. It's not the best process. It's not something that is all that great. So the rest operators handled that for us, where now we can put the 3 dots in our parameters, and you'll see we get an array of the parameters passed in. And it doesn't matter how many we pass in here or anything else, it's going to access all of those parameters, and then we can do whatever we want with it moving forward. So that's the rest operator. Arrow functions have been a great addition to JavaScript as well. You'll see here that we have this callback function that's going on here. A lot of this code has been eliminated with the arrow functions. Now keep in mind, when you use arrow functions, we are going to be eliminating some things like this and one or two other minor things that you're probably not going to come across too often, but this is kind of the major one. Excuse me. So how might we eliminate some of this code with arrow functions? Excuse me, I'm dying over here. All right, so we can eliminate this function keyword and go ahead and use an arrow like so, and we have now created an arrow function. But we can actually eliminate more code at this point by eliminating these brackets and put this on one line as well if we wanted. But when we eliminate the brackets, we can tell it to innately return that and eliminate that semicolon as well. We've eliminated a lot of code. Now reduce has a minimum of 2 parameters, but if we had 1 parameter, we could do this as well as to eliminate those brackets. So keep that in mind, or those parentheses, that those are arrow functions, how we use them, and that depending on how many parameters you have and the complexity of it, and if you're having multi-line logic in your application, you may not be able to write it like this, but they are very flexible. Arrow functions have been a great addition to JavaScript as well. You'll see here that we have this callback function that's going on here. A lot of this code has been eliminated with the arrow functions. Now keep in mind, when you use arrow functions, we are going to be eliminating some things like this and one or two other minor things that you're probably not going to come across too often, but this is kind of the major one. Excuse me. So how might we eliminate some of this code with arrow functions? Excuse me, I'm dying over here. All right, so we can eliminate this function keyword and go ahead and use an arrow like so, and we have now created an arrow function. But we can actually eliminate more code at this point by eliminating these brackets and put this on one line as well if we wanted. But when we eliminate the brackets, we can tell it to innately return that and eliminate that semicolon as well. we've eliminated a lot of code. Now reduce has a minimum of 2 parameters, but if we had 1 parameter, we could do this as well as to eliminate those brackets. So keep that in mind, or those parentheses, that those are arrow functions, how we use them, and that, you know, depending on how many parameters you have and the complexity of it, and if you're having multi-line logic in your application, you may not be able to write it like this, but they are very flexible. So let's take our add function here that we've slightly modified, and now we're passing in an array and it's calculating the values. What would happen if we didn't pass anything in? You know, we passed in an empty array. First off, reduce would fail, but in this case, if we just passed in no values, how might we solve that? Well, we can use the default parameters to assign an empty array with a 0 in it, right? Because a total should have a number in it. And so default parameters give us that ability. It gives us the ability to pass in a value when no value has been assigned. Now, something to keep in mind is that you can't go and assign a default parameter and then assign a strict parameter, something like, example, and then use example, because the reason for it is it won't know what index you're referencing in theory. So it may think that you're passing in a number. So keep that in mind. Your default parameters are always going to come after your required parameters when you're designing your functions. As JavaScript has been progressing, it has lent itself to be more modular in nature, meaning that you are going to break everything out into pieces, and you're going to be able to import and export things. And so that's what we're going to be talking about next, is import and export. It's something that I have found very helpful and useful. So let's say that we wanted to store a very large data set or a class or whatever it may be in another file so we don't jumble up our code. Well, we can use the import attribute, or the import keyword, to import, let's say, an array of values. So let's go to this data.js file, and what we're going to do is create a constant that is going to, we're just going to call it data, and this is going to be equal to an array, and we're going to throw some numbers in here. We're going to throw 1, 5, 6, 7, 8, and go ahead and throw a semicolon on here. This export keyword on this variable means that we are saying that we are okay exporting this out so another application can import it. And the way that we import it, typically your imports are going to be at the top of the file. You're going to have space between the words, and we're going to say data from, and then the file where they're coming from, right? So we have /. In our case, it's going to be data.js. But now, and it looks like my Quokka may have broken. Now we are going to be able to import the data from. Let's see this. Okay, so Quokka doesn't like me using import. That's what's going on here. I have to switch to Pro. I will in the near future, my friend. But what we're going to do here is we're going to import data from this function. And here we can, if we wanted to, we create a reference to the data. No need to, but we're just going to pass data directly into add, and now we have access to it. Let's go ahead and open up this file in a HTML page just so that we can see it in action, since Quokka is harassing us. So earlier we talked a little bit about export import, and there's another aspect of export that called default and how it affects import. Basically what default allows us to do is allows us to export a file without when we only have a single export, and then we can name it a little bit differently. Let's go ahead and give an example. So we're going to jump into data.js. Now let's take this export off and just define this as a variable, and we still want to export it. So how can we do that? Well, we only have one item in here that we're going to export, and in our case we're going to export the default value, which is data. This will allow us to export it. Now this gives us a couple different options when we import it. We can import, and remember how we did the curly braces and use that? This actually eliminates that, but again we can just do one import, and we can name it whatever we want. If we wanted to call it my data, and then just do from, like so, from data.js, or data, it would work just as well. So keep that in mind. That's another way that you can use the import and export with the default keyword. I'm not quite sure why Quokka decided to play nice, but you'll see here that we're importing data. We're then getting the value. If we wanted to here, we could console.log the data out, which is coming from our data.js file as well. So a cool little thing that we can do with importing and exporting allows us to really organize our code very easily, and a great feature. And it's worth mentioning that you can, although it's bad convention to typically have multiple values, we'll go ahead and, I don't know, we'll just create an object first, name that, first we'll just make it true, that you can, you typically would probably have a different file for this, but you can import from different files. All you would do is a comma there and have data too from our data set. So it's worth mentioning as we are continuing. Control Z, data 2 here. You can see that we're getting that object as well. Another strange feature, rather, that's been added to JavaScript is trailing commas will no longer break your code. Although I think it's kind of nice when we add things that don't break code, I don't really like things that add for sloppy code. Now, people may disagree. But so what are trailing commas? Well, when we have our array, we can go ahead and have this extra comma here at the end. And when we do it with objects, we have this extra comma here at the end, and we're not going to get any issues. And we do it with parameters, we have this extra comma here at the end, and nothing breaks. And that's really the trailing commas. So just another feature, I guess, of ES6 Plus. Arrays got a little bit of love in recent times, and what we had to do in the past when we wanted to check if a value was in an array, such as our nums array here, we would do something like this, where we would have we'd say the array dot index of, and we'd pass in the value. So let's say we want to check 5, we would get the index value of that. Now, if it wasn't included in there, we would get, and we just want to know, hey, is it in here? Is it not in here? So it kind of felt a little wonky. Let's say we did 7, we're going to get a -1 because it doesn't exist in here. And there's obviously no negative index. Well, there's a much more appropriate way of doing this now with the array method includes. Includes is going to return a Boolean to say, yeah, it's in here, or it's not in here, not in there, and then 1 you'll see is in there, so it's going to return true. It's one of my more common go-to array methods nowadays. So we're going to be covering fetch real quick before we cover async and await, and sort of really understand a little bit about promises in the process. So we're not going to be using Quokka to see the data because fetch uses a global window object which doesn't exist. And so basically what we're going to do is we're just going to look at it in the browser. But before we do that, we're going to explain a few things. So let's look here. We have this API URL which is going to bring up, if we pull up the browser real quick, it's just going to bring up some data, right? So it's going to bring up JSON data about Bitcoin. Nothing from an asynchronous location from it. It's going to be asynchronous. So what we're doing here in our get data function is we're going to fetch that data on this URL. And what that's fetch is going to do is it's going to go to this location and it's going to return a promise. And we are going to resolve that promise with this then function. And this is going to send back a response, a promise of type response, if you want to think of it that way. And before we can do anything with it, we have to turn it into JSON. We have to turn it back into a JavaScript object so that we know what to do with it. And when that's done, because this is also a promise, we are then getting the data from there. And finally, we're able to log that data, which we can see in our application here, where we open it up and we get that same data. So how might we do this a little bit more cleanly using asynchronous or async and await? Well, we can do it like so. The first thing that we have to do to understand what async and await does. Async and await sort of go hand in hand, where if we are going to write a function that we know is going to have some asynchronous aspects of it, and we want to tell our code to wait for those asynchronous aspects to complete, the way that we can do that is with async and await. And so we can start by throwing async in front of the function here. We have now made this a asynchronous function, although it doesn't quite do anything quite yet. Now what we're going to do now is we're just going to go ahead and delete what's in here, basically clean this out and start fresh. And we're going to create this const response, and this is going to store the fetch call essentially that we're going to get. And so you'll see earlier we basically had three parts. We had a fetch, then we had a then, and then go and get the data, go and get the promise of the data, then convert it into JSON, then do something with it. And we're gonna clean it up a little bit with this fetch. We're still gonna throw in the base URL, but because this is a asynchronous call, we want it to say, hey, please wait till this is done before moving on, right? Otherwise, JavaScript goes, it runs, it'd go and run the next line without this data being back. We can't have that. We need that data before we progress. And then we can go and do something like this where you say const JSON, because that's what we're gonna want. We're gonna await that response. Remember the response right here that we just got, right? Asynchronously, that we waited for. Go ahead and turn that into JSON. And remember, this is also an asynchronous call, so we need to tell it to wait for that. And then finally, we can do whatever we want with the actual data, which in our case is a JSON, and save it. And now we've used async and await to handle this asynchronous call. And you'll see now when we pull up our code again, just go to empty and clear that. We still get the data down below like we did before. Let's clear this out just so it's a little bit cleaner. And we can get the data that we want at the end of the day using async and await. Now this isn't only good for server calls, although that's most common. You can also use this when you're working with set timeout or some sort of counting that's going to happen as well. So keep that in mind as you're working with async and await. Sets have been a great addition to JavaScript, and one of the differences between a set and like an array is that sets are a list of unique values. And so how do we go about making a set? Well, let's go ahead and we'll create a constant here, and we'll call this example, and we're going to set this equal to a new set, like so. And you can initialize it with some values by just putting an array in here. And we'll say 1, comma 2, comma 3, and then we're going to throw in a 1, comma 2, comma 3 again. And you'll see that when we print it out, it's not going to have those values. Alright, so let's go ahead and console log this value. And we'll just put example. And you'll see here that we only have a set of 1, 2, and 3. And we could do this with booleans as well. True, true, false. And you'll see we're going to just have 1 true, 1 false. So it is smart enough to know, hey, if you even try and initialize it with default values or rather duplicate values, it's not going to happen. And we could do other arrays in here as well. Or can we not? Oops, excuse me, we forgot a comma. There we go. So, and then you'll see if we put another empty array in here, that's going to work because that's a new instance, right? So don't get it too confused unless we had a reference that was storing that array value, but these are both unique values. So how do we add and remove items to check if an item is in a set? Well, let's dive into it. So adding is pretty straightforward. You'll see here that we're going to go example.add. I might have given it away. Add, and we're going to add the number 11 to here, and you'll see that it's been added. And we can chain these as well if we wanted to. Add 12. I don't think we can put. Can we? Yeah, no, I don't think we can put values like so in here. Let's just clean this up just a little bit. We're getting a little off the page. So we can't chain them like we would do with pushes where you can just do one push. Not yet. I would imagine that they might add that. So if we wanted to add 13, we could do it like that. And then we have the ability to, I said add. What do you think it's going to be? Delete a value, which is pretty cool. So we're going to delete a value. In our case, we're going to delete 1. You'll see it gets removed from our list. A cool thing about delete is if we actually console.log this value, you'll see that it returns a boolean of true. The reason for that is we were successful in our deleting. And if we were to do the same thing for our add, so let's say we wanted to add 15, it's not going to do it, which is strange, right? Because You would think that it would return a Boolean as well. It does not. It just returns the updated array. So just keep that in mind. But delete does tell you if it is true or unsuccessful. If it was successful or unsuccessful. But delete, we're gonna go ahead. Let's say we do I don't know, 33. It doesn't exist. It's gonna return a Boolean of false. It's not gonna error out or anything, but it's gonna return a Boolean of false. Let's say we wanted to clear the entire set. We could do that with just calling example. Example.clear. And now we would have an empty set from that as if we just started fresh. Now, the last thing I want to cover with sets before I forget here is I want to show you how to check if a set has that value. And it's pretty straightforward. So before I clear here, let's just go ahead and we're going to console.log example.has. And this will return a Boolean as well. So if we throw in the number 5, it's going to turn false, right? Our set doesn't have the number 5 anywhere in it. But if we return the number 2, we're going to get that. And we have access to that set value. All right, I might have lied about the last thing. So sets are an iterable, so you can iterate through them with for each and for of and all that sort of stuff. You also have the ability to know what the size of the set is, and so you can do that with size, right? So we have our example dot size, which will give us the size of 6 for our set at this point, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Similar length, except size. Basically, you have a lot of the same functionality that you would expect in an array with slightly different names, probably better names in all honesty, and a little bit less when it comes to the methods. So classes might be something new if you're not from a traditional programming language or you aren't custom to Java, to object-oriented programming, and that was some great sort of some sugar to make it a little bit easier to do object-oriented programming, be more familiar. And I'm struggling today, guys. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about how we might define a class. It's pretty straightforward. In our case here, we have our animal.js file, and we want to define a animal class. And so we've essentially defined a class, but it doesn't do anything at this point. So we have what is called a constructor. This is the values we want to pass in to our class when we plan on instantiating a new version. The reason you make classes is so that you can create methods and properties that you can expect from that class, and that you don't have to, rewrite code, and you can instantiate data models and things like that. So in our constructor of our animal, we might have type, and we're going to go with the amount of type, and let's go with wild. And that will be a Boolean. Like it's someone's pet, it would be false. If it's a wild animal, we'll put it as true. And so we're going to say this.type is equal to type. This refers to our class, right? So the class property, the type here is just the value that we're passing in. And this dot wild is equal to wild. All right, cool. So we've essentially instantiated a class. And let's go ahead and use some of that import-export logic we had earlier, and we'll export the class animal here. And now when we go into our example.js, let's go ahead and import animal from /animal.js. Now, what we can do here is we create a reference to that class. So we'll go ahead and say const. What do we want to call this? We'll call it. We'll name him Tito. That's the name of my cat. Equals a new animal. And we're going to say here that Tito is a type of cat, and it is in fact. Although he thinks he is a wild beast, he in fact is not. And I, of course, forgot to start my quokka. All right, so what we can do here is, so far, we've given the animal class the ability to have a type, and you'll see it's storing that value, as well as to have a wild property. So when we reference Tito, and you'll see, nice. So now we have two properties, and we could create as many of these classes as we wanted to for whatever our needs were. We also, of course, have the ability to reset that. So let's say Tito's like, yo, man, I ain't a cat. Tito's like, yo, I am a beast, baby. And you need to know it. We could reset it to beast if we wanted to, right? So you have the ability to reset these properties as needed on your, because really at the end of the day, what you're dealing with here is an object. And so it's much easier to think of it as a way. It's an object that we've instantiated with methods and properties. And so you can pretty much do almost anything that you could to a class that you could do an object. So I mentioned, you can add functions to a class. Let's go ahead and just give an example of that. So here we're going to have a little function that's called, this is an animal class, so it's not necessarily for cats. So we're just going to call this we'll just call this roar, a little bit more generic. And we're just going to take in some sound that we're going to pass in, and all we want that to do is console. We'll have it return sound. Return hear me. We'll use a little bit of those ES6 templates, literals here, and we'll pass in sound with 3 exclamation points. So now our animal class has this roar method that if we wanted to, we could console.log, and we could say this dot Tito dot roar, and then in here we're going to pass in meow. Cannot read property roar. No, you should be able to read property roar. Excuse me, this Tito dot roar. There we go. So hear me meow, right? So we can define functions, and of course we can reference if we wanted to for whatever reason, and we didn't want to pass in a property, and we just wanted to say this is my type. We could do that by targeting this dot type as well. So the other thing you have to understand about classes is you don't always have to create an instance of a class. You can define classes and have static methods. And static methods essentially mean that the class prototype animal, in this case, has its own methods, and we don't have to create a Tito. We don't have to create a cat, right? So how do we define those methods? Well, we would use the static keyword, and we just define it, right? Static might be favorite pet, favorite animal. And we might pass in a string here, and that would be, we'll pass in type. And then we'll say something like return, my favorite animal is, we'll pass in our value here, like so, and we'll pass in the type, put a period, semicolon. And now when we go into our example.js file, let's say we didn't have any of this, we just commented this out, we would still, because we imported animal, we could say, we could get the value of animal dot favorite animal, and then we could pass in just like cat. And you'll see that it prints out just fine, because this is a static method. This is based on the class, not an instance of the class that we have created. All right, there's also gets, which are important to showcase. So let's say that we didn't want to necessarily create a property in the constructor, but we wanted to perhaps return a concatenation of stuff. It is true that we could just return stuff like roar, for instance. It's just a function, but there's actually a slightly better way of doing it, and that's with a get. So let's say we had a get metadata, and in here we're just going to return back a string that has so gets have to have returns. You're getting something, so it has to return something. And so we're using this get keyword, and then we're going to return. In this instance, all we want to do is return type, colon, and then we'll throw in a little bit of something, something, and then we'll say this dot type. And then we'll do a comma space, and then we'll say a wild, and then we'll pass in the wild status, this dot wild. This is going to allow us to know if the cat's wild or not. And to your surprise, you might say, well, how do we call it? Well, it's actually treated as a property. So now, when we want to console log that property, we would take our Tito, our instance of Tito, and then we would call metadata on it. And you would see here that the beast, wild, false, and we would have this for this metadata aspect here. Now keep in mind that the get isn't set up to take in values, so you can't reset it. This is just a get, and it will get the data, whatever you said that you need to get, right? Pretty straightforward. Get it. One of the things about classes is that classes can inherit other classes or extend other classes, and what that means essentially is that, let's just collapse what's in here real quick. Collapse all this to give us some more space. And we have an animal class, but we want to make something that inherits from animal but has its own unique properties. And so what we can do is we're going to export this class, so we can create another class, and this time we'll call it cat, and it's going to extend the animal class. So it's going to inherit from the animal class, and it's going to have a lot of the same properties of all the same unless we overwrite them. So let's say that we wanted to add, for instance, not only type and wild, but we also wanted to add a tail. Does your cat have a tail? Maybe it lost in a horrible accident. You know, sorry, little poor kitty. So we're going to define our constructor. It's still going to have a type. It's still going to have the wild status, but now it's going to have a tail property. So we're going to use this super keyword, and what that's going to do is it's going to take type, and it's going to take wild, and it's going to pass it into the parent class, the class that we are extending, right? Cat is a child of animal, and animal is a parent of child. And the only thing that we have to do here is we have to instantiate this dot tail is equal to tail. So now when we save that and we jump back up to here, we're going to first have to import cat, right, because we don't have access to it. And while we're at it, we can go ahead and get rid of all this sort of stuff. Or better yet, let's keep it. And you'll see that when we go and we add a tail, maybe we'll just as one. We'll say he has one tail. I don't know where I'm going with this, but you guys get the idea. So here's one tail, and instead you'll see that we're going to import cat, and you'll see everything works because we're inheriting those methods, while at the same time we have the ability to have new methods, right, and new properties. So we say Tito.tail, and it's going to tell us Tito has one tail, which means that Tito's doing okay. And this can go for methods and functions as well. So one thing to keep in mind is that when we extend a class, we inherit whatever methods are in that class, but we can also overwrite them. So let's take our roar class, for instance, and we're saying, okay, well, you know, instead of that roar, I want to define a roar here that has a similar property, same name, same properties. And what I want it to do is I want it to return the beast is here, and then it will put you know, sound, 3 exclamation points, something like that. And you'll notice that when we call it now, it's going to override it and put in the new method, because we have we essentially have two methods, and the way that classes are going to work is the method that is nested the most, the child method, the one that is closest to cat, is going to fire off, right? So if we have two roar methods, it's going to take cat over animal and fire off the beast is here. So that's a little bit about classes to get it up and going. So if you remember back in our object class tutorial part, we talked about my cat Tito, and we created this cat class, and JavaScript as a whole has been becoming more and more object oriented, and it's gotten a little bit of love with the get own property descriptor as well as get own property descriptors, which oops, a little misspelling here, but you guys get the idea. And what they basically do is they give us some information about the properties of our objects. So let's go ahead and console.log a value here. And this is a static method, so get own property descriptor is a singular version, right? We want to say, hey, I want to know the value of, on Tito. So we're going to pass in the object, and then we're going to pass in the property key, which in this case is going to be type. And you'll get a couple things as value. You'll get the value, you get if it's writable, if it's enumerable, and if it's configurable. Now that's get property descriptor. Now what ends up happening is there's descriptors as well, where we want to get all of the values, and let's say we want to store it, right? So we'll create a constant, we'll call this descriptors, and we'll set this equal to object.get property descriptors, and this is going to store all of those values, and then we can target it as we want. So in our example here, as we console.log these values out with Tito, we're going to get a very long list of descriptors here, and it goes on and on and on, and you'll see it's a nested array of objects. So you'll see our tail property value, and it has all the same values, and then there's other ones, but what it has done is essentially given us an object of all of those. So that's descriptor and descriptors in JavaScript, and I believe that was added in ES8 specifically. Hey guys, I just want to thank our sponsor, DevicePlus.com. They have a great Internet of Things blog where they're talking about Arduino and Raspberry Pi stuff, and if you click the Device Plus icon there, you can check out this awesome article about how to make a laser tripwire using Arduino.